I'm 72 years old, and I truly believed I was going to die that winter. The storm had already buried the road. No power, no phone signal, 5 days without seeing another human being. On the 6th morning, I pulled back the curtain, and my heart stopped. A 600-pound brown bear was sitting on my porch, not scratching, not growling, not trying to break in, just sitting there, watching my door. I didn't step outside. I didn't make a sound. I just stood there staring at it, and it stared back at me. That bear stayed outside my cabin for 9 days. 9. And what I didn't understand at the time was that it hadn't come to hurt me. It had come because of something I did 12 years earlier, something I never told anyone. Before I tell you what happened, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you looked outside right now and saw a bear sitting at your door, what would you do? If you believe animals remember kindness, subscribe, because what happened after those 9 days changed the way I see the wild forever. I have lived in this cabin for almost 20 years now, long enough for the wood to memorize the sound of my footsteps and for the wind to feel like an old neighbor rather than a threat. And until that winter, I believed I understood everything this mountain could throw at me. I moved here after my wife passed, trading the noise of town for the quiet rhythm of pine trees and snowfall, telling myself that solitude was peace and not loneliness. Though the truth is, those two things often blur when the sun sets before 5 and the world turns white and silent. That December, the storm rolled in faster than the forecast had warned, thick clouds swallowing the sky by mid-afternoon, and by nightfall, the road that connects me to the nearest town had disappeared beneath drifts taller than my porch railing. I've handled storms before. I keep firewood stacked, canned food lined neatly on the shelves, kerosene lamps ready in case the power goes. But this one felt different from the start, heavier somehow, like the mountain was holding its breath. On the second night, the electricity failed with a soft click that sounded far too small for something that would change the entire mood of the cabin. And suddenly, the only light I had was firelight flickering against the walls, stretching shadows into shapes that made the place feel less familiar. By the 4th day, the silence became oppressive. No passing trucks, no distant hum of snowplows, not even the usual call from the radio tower down the ridge. Just wind pressing against the windows and snow sliding from the roof in slow, heavy sighs. I told myself I preferred it this way, that this was why I chose to live out here. But there's a particular kind of awareness that creeps in when you realize no one could reach you, even if they tried. And that awareness settled into my chest like a stone. On the morning of the 6th day, I woke before dawn because the fire had burned low and the cold had begun to creep under the blankets. And as I pulled on my coat and moved toward the living room to stir the embers back to life, I noticed something unusual in the stillness outside. The wind had calmed overnight, leaving the world unnaturally quiet, the kind of quiet that makes even your own breathing sound too loud. I remember thinking how beautiful it must look beyond the frosted glass, how untouched and clean the snow would be, and out of habit more than curiosity. I reached up and drew back the curtain just enough to let in the grey morning light. That's when I saw it. At first, my mind refused to make sense of the shape on the porch, a dark mound against the white, too large to be a fallen branch, too deliberate to be a drift. Then it moved slightly, a slow shift of weight, and the light caught the curve of a shoulder and the thick outline of fur. A brown bear, enormous and unmistakable, was sitting no more than 8 feet from my front door. It wasn't pacing or sniffing around. It wasn't clawing at the wood or testing the windows. It was simply sitting there, facing the door, as if it expected someone to answer. My first instinct was fear, the sharp, instinctive kind that tightens your throat and sends your heart hammering so loudly you're sure the entire forest can hear it. And I froze in place, one hand still gripping the curtain, barely daring to blink. I have seen bears before from a distance, silhouettes moving between trees or tracks pressed into mud along the riverbank, but never this close, never close enough to see the slow rhythm of its breathing or the faint plume of vapor rising from its muzzle in the cold air. What unsettled me most was not its size, though it was easily 600 pounds if it was an ounce, but its stillness. It wasn't behaving like a curious animal searching for food, and it wasn't acting threatened either. It was waiting, and I could not understand why. I stayed there far longer than I should have, staring through that narrow gap in the curtain, feeling the weight of isolation settle heavier on my shoulders than the snow on the roof, because in that moment I knew something had shifted in the balance of my quiet mountain life, and whatever that bear wanted, it had chosen my door, and only my door. I did not sleep much that night, and the strange thing is, it wasn't only fear that kept me awake, it was confusion, because by every rule I thought I understood about wild animals, that bear should have moved on by sunset, should have followed the tree line down toward the river, or wandered off in search of easier shelter. Yet when I forced myself to check again in the fading light of late afternoon, it was still there, sitting in nearly the same spot, snow gathering slowly along its broad back like a blanket it refused to shake off. I kept my distance from the windows after that first long stare, moving carefully through the cabin as if sudden movement alone might provoke it, feeding the fire, counting the cans left on the shelf, measuring out coffee grounds with the deliberate calm of a man pretending he is not afraid, and every so often I would feel the pull to look again, to confirm it had finally left, but each glance through the frost-rimmed glass revealed the same unsettling sight. That massive shape anchored to my porch, not restless, not aggressive, simply present. I tried making noise in the afternoon, banging a metal pot against the stove, shouting through the door without opening it, even turning on the old generator for a few minutes to let the engine roar across the clearing. But the bear barely reacted, lifting its head once, ears twitching, then settling back into that patient posture, as though my cabin had become the only place in the forest that mattered. By the second full day of its vigil, the practical worries began to gnaw at me harder than the fear. My supplies were not endless, and though I had enough to last another week if I rationed carefully, I could not step outside for firewood without risking a confrontation, and the thought of trying to circle around the back of the cabin through waist-deep snow while a wild animal occupied my porch was enough to keep me inside. I found myself watching it longer, studying the slow rise and fall of its chest, the way it occasionally shifted its weight, and that was when I noticed something that tightened my stomach in a different way than simple terror. It favored its left hind leg, just slightly, a hesitation when it adjusted its stance, subtle but unmistakable to someone who has spent decades observing wildlife from a respectful distance. The movement stirred a memory I had not visited in years, a summer afternoon, long before my beard turned fully grey, when I had followed the distant cry of an animal into a patch of brush near the northern ridge and found a young bear caught in an illegal steel trap, its small body trembling, its leg clamped cruelly between jagged teeth of rusted metal. I remember the way it looked at me then, not with rage, but with raw animal panic, and how every sensible instinct told me to walk away, to leave nature to its own harsh balance. Yet something in me could not, perhaps because grief was already living quietly in my chest in those days, and I recognized suffering when I saw it. I had approached that cub slowly, speaking in a low voice I did not expect it to understand, using a thick jacket wrapped around my arm and a long branch to press down the trap's spring until the tension released, and when the metal jaws snapped open, the cub had scrambled free, stumbling at first, blood matting its fur, before disappearing into the undergrowth without looking back. I never told anyone about it, not because it was heroic, but because it felt private, a small act of decency in a world that had taken more from me than it had given. And over time I allowed myself to forget it, to assume the forest had absorbed that moment the way it absorbs fallen leaves and broken branches. But now, watching the massive bear outside my door shift its weight again with that same slight limp, a cold realization crept in that had nothing to do with the storm, the scar I thought I glimpsed along the back of its leg, a pale line against dark fur, when the wind lifted the snow from its coat, looked exactly where that trap had once clamped shut all those years ago. I stood there by the window longer than I should have, my breath fogging the glass, wondering if it was possible, if memory could stretch across more than a decade in the mind of an animal. And if that was true, whether the creature outside my cabin had come not as a predator circling prey, but as something far more complicated and far more dangerous to my understanding of the wild. By the third day, the fear had shifted into something heavier and more complicated, a tension that lived somewhere between my ribs and refused to settle, because the storm still had not broken and the bear still had not left. And I began to understand that whatever this was, it was no accident of weather or hunger. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained a hard, pale grey, and the clearing around my cabin looked frozen in time, untouched except for the deep, steady imprint of the bear's body on the porch and the wide tracks that circled only a few feet before returning to that same spot. It hadn't wandered into the forest to forage. It hadn't tested the windows. It hadn't even approached the woodpile stacked against the side wall. It simply remained near the door, as if proximity itself mattered. I rationed my food more carefully now, splitting cans into halves, saving the last of the dried meat, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire while my thoughts kept returning to that scar. Memory can play tricks on a man who lives alone too long. And I tried to convince myself that I was imagining the resemblance, that plenty of bears limp and plenty carry scars, but every time it shifted its weight and I caught that slight hitch in the left hind leg, the past rose up with uncomfortable clarity. Late that afternoon, as the light began to fade and the cold tightened its grip again, I saw something that erased the last of my denial. The bear slowly rose from its seated position, stretching its massive frame in a way that made the wooden boards of the porch creak faintly, even through the glass, and as it turned slightly sideways, I saw the full line of scar tissue along the back of its leg, a pale, jagged seam cutting through thick fur exactly where the steel trap had once bitten down. There are moments in a man's life when logic stops arguing and simply steps aside, and this was one of them. I knew then with a certainty that felt both impossible and undeniable that this was the same animal, no longer a trembling cub, but a creature powerful enough to tear my door from its hinges if it chose. Yet it did not choose that. Instead, after standing for a moment, it lowered itself carefully back into the snow, and that was when I noticed something else that tightened my throat in a different way. It was breathing harder than before, slow but labored, and when it shifted again, I saw fresh blood staining the fur higher up on that same leg, darker against the white snow beneath it. The realization came not as relief, but as a sobering weight. The bear had not come to hunt, nor to intimidate. It had come injured, perhaps trapped again, perhaps wounded by something worse, and the only place it had chosen to stop was here, at the cabin of the man who once freed it. I pressed my palm against the cold window pane, feeling smaller than I ever had in this forest I thought I understood, because the balance of power had shifted in a way no storm could explain. It would have been easier if it had roared or clawed at the wood, easier if it had behaved like the danger I was prepared to defend against. But instead, it waited in pain and silence, trusting or desperate, I could not yet tell which, and the longer I watched, the more the question grew in my mind. Had it remembered me all these years, or had instinct simply driven it back to the only human scent tied to survival rather than harm? Whatever the answer, one truth settled over me as night closed in again, and the temperature dropped. If that bear had come seeking help, Then the choice facing me was not about fear anymore, but about whether I was willing to step outside into the snow and risk everything to repay a debt I never expected to owe. That night, I barely touched the firewood, letting the flames burn lower than usual as I sat in the dim glow and listened to the slow rhythm of the wind moving through the trees. Because the decision forming in my mind felt heavier than the storm that had trapped me here. Every practical instinct I had developed over decades in these mountains told me to stay inside, to protect myself, to wait for the road crews or wildlife officers to eventually clear a path and handle whatever this was. But each time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark stain spreading slowly through the snow beneath that bear's leg, and I remembered the helpless sound that cub had made years ago when the trap cut into bone and flesh. The difference now was scale. This was no small creature I could approach with a jacket wrapped around my arm and a lucky stretch of courage. This was 600 pounds of muscle and instinct, capable of ending my life in seconds if I misread even a single movement. Yet despite that knowledge, what unsettled me most was not the danger, but the quiet certainty that it had chosen this porch deliberately, that out of the vast forest stretching for miles in every direction, it had dragged its injured body to my door and nowhere else. Just after dawn on the fourth morning of its vigil, when the sky lightened enough to reveal the clearing in cold blue tones, I pulled on my thickest coat, layered gloves over stiff fingers, and stood by the door longer than I cared to admit, listening for any sign of aggression beyond the wood. I spoke before I moved, my voice low and steady, the same tone I had used years ago with the cub, not because I believed it understood words, but because fear can travel through silence faster than sound, and I did not want to carry mine outside with me. When I finally unlatched the door and opened it only a few inches, the cold rushed in sharply, but the bear did not lunge or rise. It lifted its head slowly and looked at me, and there was something in that gaze that did not feel like challenge. I widened the door another inch, then another, until the entire scene stood clear before me, the massive body, the thick fur matted with ice along its flank, and the wound on its leg, not a trap this time, but a deep gash, likely from barbed wire or a hunter's careless snare, swollen and raw against the winter air. I did not step fully onto the porch. Instead, I placed a small sack of dried meat and an old first aid kit just beyond the threshold, and retreated a half step, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The bear did not move for several long seconds, and in those seconds I understood how fragile the line was between trust and disaster, how one wrong twitch could shatter whatever strange understanding existed between us. Then slowly it shifted forward, favoring the injured leg heavily now, and lowered its head toward the sack, not tearing into it wildly, but sniffing with cautious deliberation. I spoke again, barely above a whisper, telling it nothing of importance, only that I remembered, only that I would not hurt it, while my hands trembled despite every effort to steady them. When it settled back into the snow with the food and began to eat, I saw clearly that the wound would not heal on its own, that infection had already begun to set in, and the weight of what needed to be done pressed down on me harder than any snowfall. If that bear had come here because it remembered the man who once freed it, then standing safely behind my door was no longer enough. And as I watched it lift its head again, eyes meeting mine through the thin veil of rising breath in the cold, I realized that stepping outside had only been the beginning of a choice that would either bind our fates together or end mine where I stood. I have never believed myself to be a brave man, only a stubborn one, and sometimes the two look similar from the outside. But as I stood there with the door cracked open and the cold air cutting through my coat, I understood that stubbornness alone would not be enough for what I was about to do. The bear finished the small offering of dried meat more slowly than I expected, not with the frantic tearing of a starving animal, but with deliberate, careful bites, as though conserving strength. And when it shifted again, the injured leg trembled beneath its weight before giving way slightly. forcing it back down into the snow with a low rumble that was more pain than warning. I had seen infections before, on cattle, on hunting dogs, even once on my own arm after a bad cut, and I recognized the swelling and stiffness for what they were. If that wound closed over wrong or turned septic, the winter would finish what the trap or wire had started, and the forest would take back the life I had once helped preserve. The thought settled in me with uncomfortable clarity. If this animal had dragged itself here because it remembered the only human who had ever relieved its suffering, then I could not repay that memory with hesitation. The hardest part was not stepping onto the porch, though my legs felt heavier than they had in years, but lowering myself slowly into the snow so that I did not tower over it like a threat. I kept my movements measured, speaking softly in the same calm cadence I had used long ago. And when the bear lifted its head again, its eyes did not flash with aggression. Instead, they watched me with an intensity that felt less like challenge and more like calculation. There is no romance in standing 5 feet from a creature that outweighs you several times over. Every nerve in your body is aware of how easily bone can break and how quickly instinct can override memory. But there was something else present in that moment, something fragile and unspoken, and I chose to lean into that rather than retreat. I slid the first aid kit across the snow with slow, deliberate pushes, then stopped and waited, giving the bear time to process the movement. It sniffed the air, then the kit, then shifted its injured leg slightly, as if acknowledging what I already knew, that the pain was no longer manageable alone. What happened next will sound foolish to some and reckless to others, and perhaps it was both, but I moved closer by inches rather than steps, stopping each time the bear's muscles tensed, retreating half a pace when I sensed the line being tested. I never touched its head or its shoulders. I focused only on the wound, keeping my gaze low, not meeting its eyes for too long. When I finally reached the leg, I saw clearly that a length of rusted wire had cut deep into the flesh, likely snagged on debris under the snow, and tightened with each attempt to pull free. The skin around it was inflamed and raw, and a faint, sour scent of infection lingered in the air despite the cold. My hands shook as I reached for the small pair of pliers from the kit, and I whispered a steady stream of meaningless reassurance. Not because I believed the bear understood language, but because silence felt more dangerous than sound. When the metal tool touched the wire, the bear's entire body went rigid, and for one suspended heartbeat, I thought I had misjudged everything. That instinct would surge and end the fragile trust we stood upon. But it did not strike. It did not roar. It only exhaled sharply, a deep guttural breath that fogged the air between us. I worked slowly, carefully loosening the wire where it had twisted into the wound, pulling back only when the bear shifted, waiting for the tension to ease before trying again. Time lost its usual shape in those minutes. There was only breath, cold, and the steady pulse of fear beneath my ribs. Finally, with one careful twist and pull, the last length of wire came free, stained dark and bent beyond use, and I tossed it aside into the snow. Blood welled briefly before slowing, and I used what antiseptic I had, knowing it would sting, watching the bear's muscles tighten but hold steady. I did not attempt to bandage it fully. No cloth would stay long in this weather, but I did what I could to clean the wound and clear debris, trusting that fresh air and freedom from the constriction would allow the body to begin repairing itself. When I leaned back at last, my knees aching and fingers numb despite the gloves, the bear remained still for several long seconds, then slowly tested its weight on the injured leg. It did not collapse. It did not cry out. It simply stood, steadier than before. For a moment, we remained there, facing each other in the quiet clearing, the storm clouds finally thinning to reveal a pale wash of sunlight across the snow. I expected it to turn and lumber back into the forest immediately, but instead it held my gaze, not in a human way, not with gratitude as we like to imagine it, but with a recognition that felt grounded in something simpler and older than words. Then, without sound or ceremony, it turned toward the tree line, each step more certain than the last, leaving behind a pattern of deep tracks that led away from my porch and back into the vast white of the mountains. I stayed kneeling in the snow long after it disappeared between the pines, my breath unsteady, my heart still racing from the realization of how close I had come to catastrophe and how strangely calm I felt despite it. When I finally rose and stepped back inside the cabin, closing the door against the cold, the silence felt different than before. Not oppressive, not heavy, but settled. The road crews reached the ridge 2 days later, and life resumed its predictable rhythm. But each winter since then, when the snow falls thick and the world grows quiet again, I sometimes wake before dawn and glance toward the porch out of habit. Most mornings, there is nothing but wind-swept drifts and frost on the railing. But every so often, I find large tracks circling the clearing at a respectful distance before disappearing back into the trees. And when I see them, I leave a small offering of food at the edge of the woods, not because I believe the bear needs it, and not because I expect to see it again, but because some debts are not measured in fear or survival. They are measured in memory.